Well, hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. This time round, I'm featuring this car, the Ferrari 412, which, as ever, just happens to be in for work. We don't contrive these things, they just happen on an ad hoc basis around what cars we've actually got in for work. This is quite an interesting car in the Ferrari model lineup. It's basically been the same, it was the same car from 1972 to 1989, 17 years this car was in production in different forms. And to sort of keep it going and keep it fresh and making people who buy one think they bought something that isn't last year or the year before model, they changed the name a few times. So it started life as, in 1972, as the 365 GT4 2+2. Which in Ferrari speak means 365cc times 12 equals 4.4 litre, 4,400, 365cc per pot. Then the GT4 bit means a Gran Turismo car with 4 camshafts, which the engine still has, 2+2 interior seating. So that's where we arrive at the rather interesting nomenclature. Enzo Ferrari, or probably not him by that time, but certainly strategists within Ferrari realized that a gentleman's express, to use a very old expression, ought to have a manual gearbox and power steering. So in 1976, Ferrari came out with the 400, which was a warmed over version of the 365 GT 2+2. No more than that, really. Still on horizontal Weber DCOE carburetors, and they married it with an automatic gearbox, a turbo TH400 General Motors gearbox, which was used by Rolls-Royce, Jaguar by then, just on the V12 cars, a lot of American vehicles. It was the sort of go-to 3-speed automatic gearbox of the 70s and to a certain extent the 80s, or one of them. And obviously they got it right because they sold approximately twice as many automatics from that point on as they did manuals. So it was a real hit. And then we got onto the fuel injection cars. The same thing happened with the Berlinetta Boxer and the 308 in the late 70s, early 80s. They exhaust emissions started to strangulate every car manufacturer, and Ferrari was no exception. They detuned the engine from 340 brake horsepower down to about 305, which was, scraping the barrel a bit, really. Then they decided they could do better, and a couple of years later, in 1981-82, came out with some mods to the engine to restore it to about 330. And then in 1986, I think, they decided the 400i needed, as it was called by then, needed another shot in the arm, and they called it the 412 by increasing the cc to just under 5 litres. Essentially the same car. They could hardly alter the appearance of it in those 17 years at all. They went from 3 rear lights per side to 2 on the from the 365 to the 400. The 400 had chrome strips along here, stainless steel strips. They decided the best thing to do was delete them on the 412 to make it look more modern, which was actually coming full circle to the 365 GT4 2+2. They just kept stoking the furnace of the 365 400 series for years and years and years. And it was a good seller. They sold a lot of them. I've done a lot of work on these over the last 40 years. I think I first rebuilt the engine on one of these, I think about 1991, something like that. But I used to look after them before that. It's a very detuned Daytona engine. When it was the 365 GT 2+2 in 1972, the Ferrari Daytona was just still in production. Same bottom end, slightly different piston specification, but you could take the cylinder block from one and put it in the other. You could take the bearings, the crankshaft, everything out of the Daytona and put it in this, and vice versa. The cylinder heads were different. But it's a detuned version. This again, Ferrari took the engine from the 365 GTC4, another very svelte coupe actually, which has really finally come of recognition. But if all this seems very nerdy, the upshot of it is The basic car lasted 17 years. Now, I've deliberately parked a Fiat 130 Coupe next to it, just out of interest for various reasons, but not least of all, and I mentioned this when I did a video on a Fiat 130 Coupe a while back. I bought a Fiat 130 Coupe, my passion for Italian cars, and they were worth nothing at the time comparatively. I bought a Fiat 130 Coupe when I was 19, in 1981, 82, and I thoroughly enjoyed that car. I did a lot of work on it, rebuilt the engine, had a friend retrim the interior who was doing trim work, and then unfortunately did something stupid and on a wet road wrapped it round a lamppost. That was the end of that particular Fiat 130 Coupe, unfortunately. What I loved about the 130 Coupe was the styling, lots of things, the elegance, the beautiful sound of the V6 engine. The luxurious interior, Pininfarina styling, all those things. And I actually preferred, this is where I'm starting to get controversial now, do I care? I preferred the styling of that to this car, actually. I thought it was a far more rounded and fulfilled design as a piece by Paolo Martin than this particular shape, but that is open to interpretation. I'm sure there's plenty of people who will disagree with me. But the interesting thing is, both these cars were made by the Fiat group. So Fiat owned a majority shareholding in Ferrari by the time this car came along, in its first iteration in 1972. And Giovanni Agnelli, the head of Fiat, had 130s as his personal transport. He didn't have a Ferrari. Of course, he could have done just like that. He loved his cars. We've got a Jensen FF here, which we've been restoring, which was loaned to Giovanni Agnelli at his request by the Jensen press office. So we know he was into his cars in a big way. He even had a special estate car called an Opera, I think, made for him out of a Fiat 130 at huge expense, almost certainly. But where I'm going with this is, when I got the 130 and enjoyed it when I was a teenager still, I drove it. I lived in Wallasey on the end of the Wirral, under the River Mersey from Liverpool by tunnel. I used to drive the Fiat 130 around when I could afford to pay the petrol for it, and the noise it made, it has a beautiful raspy exhaust. There were various Italian cars in the 1960s and 70s that had they had a certain acoustical phenomenon going on in their exhaust systems, and they did not use basalt or padding material like the British exhaust manufacturers. They used perforated material in boxes, so a different philosophy for different nations for exhaust systems around the world, which I find quite interesting in itself, really. And the Italians went for this perforated system. They had resonators in the exhaust. I'm going to cover this more in another video in relation to Harry's Espada, because we've been doing some exhaust research work on that. But the net result of all this was the 130 Coupe had a raspy exhaust like an Alfa Romeo Alfa Sud, sweet little flat four engine. If you hear Subarus these days, they sound great with the flat four engine, but they don't have that sonorous exhaust. It's quite a boomy sound. Not unpleasant, I may say, but there's no frisson of frequencies going on within it. It's just a basic booming flat four sound. The Italians, the Alfa Sud was a sweet, sweet little car. But the Fiat 130 Coupe with the 3.2 litre V6, even though it wasn't tuned to the same extent as this, nowhere near, it still made a lovely, lovely noise with its standard original exhaust system on it. And that was one of the things that attracted me to the car, being into music and sound. And it's still a lovely, lovely sound. And I'm actually going to take a 130 Coupe back to the Mersey Tunnel at some point and rediscover my youth and compare and contrast to other cars, but that's for another time. Where am I going with this? 1970s, we had these two cars in production with each other, and I'm going to look at prices for a moment. And I have my trusty motor show reviews here. And the Ferrari 365 GT4 2+2, which, as I explained, is very, very similar to this car, in 1972 was £12,961. The Fiat 130 Coupe was £5,257. Well, just to put this into context, shockingly, a new Range Rover in the same year would have set you back the princely sum of £2,628. That's half the price of the Fiat and 20% of the price of this car, a new Range Rover. Now, the Range Rover hadn't asserted itself as the super luxury brand it is today, but nevertheless, a fascinating insight into the hierarchy of car prices in the 1970s. But so the Fiat, I mean, the Fiat was, it was amazing that they actually called it a Fiat, because it wasn't a typical Fiat at all. Yeah, as I say, it's never going to be this car, but an interesting insight. Different horses for different courses. Now, I'm not for one moment saying that these cars are comparable, because the performance of this car is off the scale compared to the 130 Coupe. I'd had my 130 Coupe, I'd enjoyed the noise, and I thought to myself, if this is what a V6 sounds like, wow, what does an Italian V12 sound like, a Ferrari, for example? And when I started to hear the V12s, when I started to work on them from 21 years old onwards, the first time I got a Daytona in particularly, yes, they make the most fabulous noise, but I was slightly spoilt by the noise of the Fiat. I say this in very hushed tones, but it didn't have that aural magic that the humble little Fiat 130 V6 did. I believe one of the reasons, and this is where I'm drilling down to in this video really, is the 130 Coupe was an excellent all-round car. They rusted like you wouldn't believe. You could almost hear them fizzing as the rusting process was taking place, particularly in the British climate. That car developed around about 165 brake horsepower, which is 50 bhp a litre. I mean, it's very low. It's sort of Ford V6 territory of the era, almost. Why did Fiat restrict it with that tiny little twin-choke carburettor on top of the engine? Because I suspect people would have bought those instead of this. And that wasn't on, that wasn't acceptable. We've got a 130 Coupe here, the one that I did the video on, and it's got a triple carburettor setup instead of a single carb, which I believe the engine has always been crying out for, really. It's got some mildly gas-flowed heads, and it develops about 25% more power than that, taking it up to round about 220, 230 brake horsepower. And this car develops 340, so it's still never going to be near the performance of this car. It's not a driver's car in the way this is, but is this a case of company politics overriding and overruling? If that had been half the price of this car, but still capable of 130, 140 miles an hour, I think it would have seriously encroached on this car's territory. And I think that's why Fiat deliberately restricted the 130 Coupe. Let's think about it. Beautiful Pininfarina styled body, tick. Thoroughbred mechanicals, nice driveline, tick. Lovely noise, tick. Beautifully crafted interior with wood and leather, or velour as it was in the Fiat 130 Coupe. Leather was an extra, tick. Understated elegance, yes. The reason why these cars did sell so well, in Italy particularly, was that there were a lot of crime around kidnappings and things in the 1960s in Italy of very wealthy people. And of course, the reason why they picked those is because they could afford to pay the ransom. So they didn't want to be seen in the likes of Lamborghini Miuras or whatever, Ferrari Berlinetta Boxers or Daytonas. They wanted something a little more low-key, which fitted in with normal traffic a bit more, wasn't so blindingly obvious. And that's why this and that in Italy did very well, because they were deliberately made to be elegant and classy rather than in your face and completely eye-locking, really. So this is coming for some work. I just think it's an interesting observation. This is something that I went through between the ages of sort of 19 and 21, a whole discovery of these Italian exotic cars. And I've always thought to myself, why was the 130 Coupe never given a good innings? It's never going to be a Ferrari, but it could have started to take customers from them. I mean, a lot of car manufacturers fall into that category. The politics sometimes are incredible. I think back to the Triumph Stag of the 1970s. Michelotti designed, elegant car. Triumph put that pretty awful V8 in it with big end bearings that are only just fit for purpose in terms of surface area. Once you start to tune the engines, they start to complain. The cylinder heads are a nightmare to get off because you've got those studs that with the slotted screws on the top. You've got the water pump sighted on top of the engine. I mean, cross-flow radiators, timing chains that failed. The Triumph Stag, undeservedly to a large extent, but it's no lie that it had a reliability problem. Why didn't they just put the all-alloy, lighter, more reliable, just as powerful, if not more so, Rover V8 into the Triumph Stag? Company politics. The Stag would have handled better, it would have gone better, it would have lasted longer. You know, there's been so many instances of company politics overriding sensibility. And I think, to a certain extent, this is one of them. Okay, I may be slightly over the top about the Fiat 130, but these are a very, very understated car. They did find their place in the market. I've known people over the years who have had F40s and all sorts of other cars. And they've been quite vocal in their appreciation of the 400 automatic, so it did have its place. But we're going to look at this car. I'm going to take it for a drive, and we'll see how well or not it's performing. It's come in for a tranche of work, so yeah, we'll take it on the road and see how it's behaving. Yeah, I'm just letting this warm through before I actually start driving it to see what is or is not happening with the engine. And I can already tell there is something very wrong with the rear suspension, and I know exactly what that is. That is the self-leveling units have nitrogen-filled spheres, the same as Citroën's, and it's actually, what's happened is they've lost the pressure inside and they're bottoming out. So yeah, we can take care of that. The spheres need repressurizing or replacing. So yeah, there's the first point. Brakes feel okay. We've now got good T's and P's, temperatures and pressures. Let's see what this car is or is not doing. Using the Fiat 130 transmission selector. Oof. A whole lot of nothing, really. That's very interesting. There's something obviously drastically wrong with this. Yeah, we've got a fuel problem somewhere. It's actually got two fuel injection systems on this car, same as the Testarossa, although the Testarossa is this is Cagetronic, Testarossa's KE. It's actually okay if I don't floor the throttle. so it's got a restriction on the fuel system. As I say, we've got a pump on each side, and it is 2 separate fuel injection systems. So we need to start having a look at that's better, if you just don't give it full throttle. But nevertheless, this car is not driving like a Ferrari at the moment. They are a very accessible car. They're quite the driver's car, actually. Obviously not in the same way a Daytona is, but as a 2+2, yeah, it's really bogging down, this engine. It's very much not happy, but that's okay. We can sort that. But handling wise, they don't roll particularly. They've always been good handling cars, these. Gearbox, the weight distribution's pretty good on them. You've got room in the back for 2 small people. Yeah, I mean, I've actually not thought too kindly of these on occasion, but when they're right, which this car at the moment is not, they are actually quite pleasant. And of course, it is a world apart away from driving a Fiat 130 Coupe, but Leonard Setright did describe the 130 Coupe as one of the finest handling cars ever made. So all things considered, is this 60% better than a Fiat 130 Coupe? That's a very interesting question. It does suit the automatic gearbox admirably, though. It really does. And it is strange because, as I say, the automatic transmission selector is actually straight out of a Fiat 130 Coupe. They stole that from the Fiat 130 parts bin. And also the interior door release handles. These are from the Fiat 130 as well. The boot lock is from a Cadillac Alante, I believe, a limited edition convertible Cadillac. And the reason why they did that is to give the soft close boot operation like Mercedes did with their doors and things like that. I've seen some very unfortunate people at car auctions when these have come up 412s, and they've been lifting the boot lid and slamming it to try and close it down, not realizing it has a soft close mechanism and potentially damaging it in the process, which is very, very unpleasant because it wasn't actually their car to do it with. But the boots, you've got to know these things, otherwise you can quickly, a lot of people, frankly, one of the frustrations for me is that a lot of people are really only skilled at destroying expensive machinery. But anyway, rant over. But yeah, this car is way below par at the moment, but that's okay. We can rejuvenate it. That's what we do. We have the technology. We can rebuild it. And it won't cost $6 million. It just makes it all the more satisfying when the car is fixed and it's going really well, because you know you've done, a good job. So yeah, there's going to be a part 2 to this video when we get this car sorted out. And the bumps, I can feel the bumps very much because there's no give in the rear damping due to those gas spheres being inoperative. So plenty of work to do on this car, but it will be a very rewarding project. Well, that concludes another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. Please like, please subscribe, and we'll be back with something else very soon.